the sound of a shovel hitting dry ground. Then again, and again. She came to him on her own. She paid him her money. She took off her shoes. And then she started digging. She thought it was a ritual, part of the ceremony. He told her, "Bury yourself to the waist, and your husband will come back to you. The earth will take your pain. The spirits will hear you." She believed him. She had no reason not to. Everyone in her neighborhood knew his name. Everyone said he was powerful. She had saved up for months to afford this appointment. Some women borrowed money from relatives. Some sold jewelry. The price was high, but that was part of it. A powerful healer does not work cheaply. She climbed into the hole. The soil packed around her hips. She couldn't move her legs. She couldn't run. That's when he walked up behind her. 42 women came to this man willingly. 42 women disappeared. 42 bodies were found in a single field, all in the same position, all with their heads pointed in one direction, toward his house. His name was Ahmad Suradji. In Indonesia, people feared him, respected him, and traveled from distant villages to pay him for his help. He had a title. He had a reputation. He had a waiting list. Women sat across from him in his living room, told him the most private details of their lives, and he listened carefully, nodded, and named a price. Then he walked them into a field at night and killed them. This is not a story about the supernatural. It is a story about something far more dangerous, unconditional trust. How a man builds a killing system inside the blind spot of an entire community. How 11 years of murder go undetected because the victims are poor, because the system does not look hard enough, and because the killer has made himself indispensable. And how it all ended, not through brilliant detective work, not through a tip from an informant, but because a 15-year-old boy gave an honest answer to a question. To understand Ahmad Suradji, you first have to understand the world he came from, because without that world, none of this is possible. North Sumatra, Indonesia, the sprawling city of Medan, the third largest city in Indonesia, a place of 2 million people, loud markets, colonial architecture left over from Dutch rule, and neighborhoods that shift from urban density to rural quiet within a few kilometers. And surrounding Medan, the districts, Deli Serdang, Langkat, Serdang Bedagai, flat land, plantation agriculture, rivers cutting through jungle, and communities that have lived the same way for generations. The 1980s and 1990s in this part of Indonesia were a period of rapid economic development on paper. The Suharto government was building infrastructure, expanding industry, projecting growth. But for rural families and urban poor in North Sumatra, the modernization happening in Jakarta felt distant. Life was governed by local economies, local relationships, and local belief systems that had existed long before any national government had an opinion about them. Indonesia is the fourth most populous country on earth, over 200 million people. The government officially recognizes 6 religions: Islam, Protestantism, Catholicism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. Religious identity is printed on every citizen's national ID card. Indonesia is, on paper, a nation of structured, recognized faith. But underneath that official layer, there is another system, older than any of those 6 religions, woven into daily life across every island, every province, every village, present in cities and rice paddies equally, not hidden, not shameful, simply parallel. It is the world of the Dukun. The word comes from Old Javanese. A Dukun is a traditional healer, a shaman, a practitioner of spiritual power, someone who works in the space between the visible world and the invisible one. The specific practices vary by island, by ethnic group, by tradition. A Dukun in Java works differently from one in Sumatra, who works differently from one in Kalimantan. But the fundamental social role is consistent across all of them. The Dukun is the person you go to when the ordinary world has no solution. They are not figures of suspicion. They are not marginal. In the 1990s, and still today, Dukuns operated openly across Indonesia. Some had offices, some had printed business cards, some charged consultation fees comparable to private doctors. They were recommended by neighbors, by mothers-in-law, by market traders, by government clerks who would never admit it publicly, but privately swore by a particular healer's ability. People went to Dukuns when medicine failed, when marriages fell apart and counseling did not exist as a culturally accessible concept, when a business collapsed and no logical explanation could be found, when a woman could not conceive and the hospital had run out of answers, when a child was sick with something that did not respond to treatment, when someone believed they had been cursed by a jealous neighbor, a rejected suitor, a business rival, and needed the curse removed before it destroyed everything. In rural North Sumatra in the 1990s, if your husband was cheating, you didn't call a lawyer. There was no mechanism for that. You went to the Dukun to bind him back to you. If you wanted to attract a husband, increase your beauty, improve your luck in business, the Dukun was the practical solution. This was not the behavior of uneducated people who didn't know better. This was the behavior of an entire society operating according to a coherent, internally consistent worldview in which spiritual forces were as real and as actionable as physical ones. Into this world, Ahmad Suradji had positioned himself with precision. He was born on January 10, 1949, in North Sumatra. He was of Javanese descent. His family had come to Sumatra as part of the transmigration programs that moved Javanese populations to other Indonesian islands during the colonial and early independence periods. This gave him a dual cultural identity: Javanese heritage with its rich tradition of mysticism and spiritual practice lived in the Sumatran context where local shamanic traditions were equally strong. He settled on the outskirts of Medan in the Deli Serdang district, on land adjacent to a large sugarcane plantation. He kept cattle. That was his registered occupation, the livelihood that appeared on official documents. Cattle breeding in rural Sumatra was modest, unglamorous work. It attracted no attention. But his real income and his real identity came from his practice as a healer. He had given himself the title Datuk Maringgi. In Minangkabau culture, the dominant ethnic group in West Sumatra and influential across North Sumatra, Datuk is a title of respect, an elder, a clan leader, a figure of communal authority. Suradji was not Minangkabau by origin, but he had adopted the title and it had stuck. His clients called him the Datuk. His neighbors called him the Datuk. In local vocabulary, the title carried weight. It placed him above a simple healer and into the category of a community patriarch with spiritual authority. His household was, by local standards, not unusual in its structure. He had 3 wives, all biological sisters. Their names were Tumini, Rosmiati, and Sariem. Polygamy is legally permitted in Indonesia under Islamic family law, with conditions that include the wife's consent and a judge's approval. In rural communities across North Sumatra in the 1990s, polygamous households were uncommon but not scandalous. That all three women were siblings was noted by neighbors as slightly unusual, but not alarming. He was known as generous. He donated to families in the neighborhood who were struggling. He helped with funeral costs when someone died without enough money for a proper burial. He was present at community events. He kept his property tidy. He spoke quietly and never started conflicts. In the vocabulary of community character assessment, the informal way that neighbors describe one another, Ahmad Suradji was a good man, trustworthy, the kind of person you were glad lived nearby. Women came from Medan, from villages an hour's drive away, from other districts in North Sumatra. Some had been referred by friends who claimed their lives had improved after seeing him. Others had heard his name mentioned in passing and sought him out through intermediaries. His practice functioned entirely on word of mouth. No advertising, no signage, just the slow, reliable spread of reputation through networks of women talking to women. He charged between $200 and $400 per session, a price calibrated deliberately. For a poor family in North Sumatra in the 1990s, this represented weeks or months of income. The high price was not incidental. In the logic of spiritual markets, price signals power. A healer who charges almost nothing is a healer who can do almost nothing. A healer who demands sacrifice, financial sacrifice in this case, is a healer whose services are worth something real. Many of the women who came to him had saved for the appointment over months. Some had borrowed from relatives or moneylenders. Some had sold possessions to come up with the fee. They arrived having already invested in the outcome. That investment created commitment. It made them less likely to question instructions that seemed unusual. They had paid too much to turn back. He was trusted completely. By the time of his arrest in 1997, he had been practicing as a healer in that location for more than a decade. Nobody had connected the disappearances of women in the district to the quiet man with the cattle and the spiritual reputation. That trust was not something he stumbled into. It was something he had built, maintained, and weaponized, deliberately, patiently, over years. The year was 1986. Ahmad Suradji was 37 years old. He had been living his double life for years, cattle breeder by official record, spiritual healer by practice. By all external measures, life was stable. His household functioned. His clients came. His reputation held. Then, according to his own account given to police investigators after his arrest, his dead father came to him in the night. His father's name was Suradji Sr. The son had taken the father's name as his own, as was common practice in Javanese naming traditions. The father had died years earlier, but in this dream, which Suradji described in careful detail across multiple interrogation sessions, the dead man appeared with unusual clarity. He was not vague or impressionistic, the way dreams often are. He was specific. He had a message, and the message had a number in it. Kill 72 women. After each killing, drink her saliva. Do this until the number is complete, and in return, your power will become absolute. You will be the greatest healer in the land. Disease will submit to your authority. People will travel from across Indonesia to seek your help. Your name will be known everywhere. 72. That was the transaction. What happened next is the part of this story that most people find hardest to process, because the response of Ahmad Suradji to this dream was not terror. It was not the desperate prayer of a man trying to push a dark thought out of his mind. It was not even ambivalence, it was evaluation. He considered the proposal, he assessed the practical challenges, and he made a decision. His own words, taken from the police interrogation transcript, read into the court record, confirmed by multiple investigators, and cited in court documents. My father did not tell me to kill specific people, but I decided if I wait for 72 women to die naturally, it will take an eternity. I chose to speed up the process myself. This statement tells you everything you need to understand about what followed. He was not in the grip of a psychotic episode. He was not acting impulsively. He acknowledged the goal, 72 deaths, as an objective. He assessed the natural timeline as impractical. He identified the most efficient path to the goal. And then he designed a system. The system had to accomplish several things simultaneously. It had to bring the victims to him voluntarily, because hunting strangers was risky and would attract attention. It had to create physical conditions in which a woman could not resist or escape. It had to leave minimal evidence and provide plausible explanations for the disappearances. And it had to remain invisible indefinitely because the goal required 72 iterations. He designed the ritual. Clients already came to him. That was the foundation. He would select from among his clients women who had come seeking help with problems that left them emotionally vulnerable and financially invested. He would accept their payment in advance. He would schedule the ritual for night, when darkness would prevent anyone from seeing what happened in the field. He would explain that the session had to take place at the edge of the sugarcane plantation, a specific location charged with spiritual energy, he would say, remote enough to be private, close enough to his property that he knew the ground. He would have the woman remove her shoes, bare feet on the earth. He would frame this as spiritual preparation. Then he would give her a shovel and explain that she must personally prepare the ritual space. This was not unusual. Dukun rituals frequently involved physical participation by the client. The act of digging, he would tell her, was itself part of the healing process. Her energy, transferred through her hands into the ground, would amplify the power of what followed. She would dig. She would not question it. The strangeness was expected. When the hole was ready, he would ask her to stand in it. The earth packed around her waist and hips would immobilize her lower body completely. She could not run. She could not kick with force. She could not shift her body weight to defend herself. He would approach from behind. The strangulation took seconds on a person who could not move from the waist down. After she was dead, he would fulfill the ritual requirement, drinking her saliva. He would then remove all clothing from the body. He explained this to investigators as deliberate. Clothing slows decomposition, retains identifying features, and preserves forensic evidence. Without clothing, the body would break down faster and be harder to identify if ever found. The final act was burial. The body was placed in the hole, positioned with the head facing in the direction of his house. This was the spiritual component, the belief that the dead woman's spirit would remain anchored to him, directed toward his home, feeding his power as a healer rather than dissipating into the general spirit world. He began in 1986. He killed for the first time. Then again, months later. Then again. The system worked. No one came asking questions. No investigation materialized. The woman was simply gone, and the world moved on without her. He continued. Between 1986 and 1997, Ahmad Suradji killed approximately 4 women per year. The pace was uneven. There is no way to reconstruct the exact chronology because many of the victims were identified only by physical remains and personal belongings, without precise dates of death. But 42 deaths across 11 years produces that average. He did not hunt. He did not stalk. He did not select victims from a distance and plan abductions. The entire architecture of his method was built around a simple fact. The victims came to him. He never had to find them. They sat in his house, in his living room, and they told him things they had told no one else. The shame of an unfaithful husband, the terror of financial collapse, the grief of miscarriage after miscarriage, the exhaustion of caring for a sick parent with no resources, the loneliness of a woman whose family had stopped listening. He listened with patience. He created the impression of deep attention. This was itself a skill, the ability to hold space for someone's pain in a way that made them feel seen. In a social environment where women from poor families had very few people who would listen to them seriously, this was powerful. It was the reason they came back. It was the reason they recommended him to others. His victims ranged in age from 11 to 30 years old. The youngest were girls, children sent with or without adult accompaniment by family members who believed the Datuk could help with something. The oldest were women in the middle of adult lives, navigating marriages, finances, and the kind of slow-building crises that have no single dramatic moment, but accumulate over years. The majority came from low-income households in Medan and the surrounding Delhi Serdang district. They were domestic workers, market traders, farmers' wives, daughters of laborers. Several traveled from other parts of North Sumatra, from Langkat to the north, from Simalungun to the south, having heard of the Datuk through extended family or community networks. The economic profile of his victim selection was not incidental. It was structural. Suradji had spent years operating inside communities where poverty and faith intersected in ways that created specific vulnerabilities. A woman with a serious problem and limited resources had a narrow set of options: prayer, family support, and the Dukun. Of those three, the Dukun was often the most tangible. Prayer offered no guaranteed mechanism. Family was often part of the problem. The Dukun offered something that felt like agency, a specific action, a ritual, a transaction that could change things. When a woman from a poor family disappeared in rural North Sumatra in the late 1980s or 1990s, the investigation that typically followed was brief. Police at the district level were understaffed, operating under large caseloads, and in an era before digital record-keeping that would have made cross-referencing missing persons reports across districts possible. A file was opened. Questions were asked of immediate family. If no obvious crime scene existed, if no body was found, if no witness reported violence, the case was categorized as a disappearance and gradually deprioritized. Suradji had, whether consciously or through experience, identified a victim profile that the system was structurally least likely to pursue. Some clients came alone. Others traveled with a companion, a sister, a friend, a neighbor who accompanied them for safety and waited outside during the session. Those companions waited. The session took time. That was expected. When the wait stretched longer than seemed reasonable, some would knock on the door and be told the ritual was still ongoing and they should wait. Eventually, they would be sent home, told that the client had left through another way, or needed time alone in meditation, or would find her own way back. The companion would leave. The walk home in the early dark of a Sumatran evening was long enough that she would arrive after nightfall. She would sleep. She would wake in the morning expecting news. When news did not come, confusion would begin, then fear, then the visit to police. By that point, Suradji had had hours to complete the burial, hours to wash, hours to resume the ordinary rhythms of his household. Nur Hayati was 22 years old when she disappeared in 1994. She had come to Suradji seeking spiritual intervention for her mother's serious illness, a woman who had already spent months in a hospital that could not stabilize her condition. Nur Hayati had borrowed the consultation fee from a relative. Her family filed a missing persons report within 2 days of her disappearance. The report was logged. No follow-up investigation connected it to any other case. Her body was recovered from the field in 1997, identified through personal belongings found at the burial site. Risma Simanjuntak was 25. She had recently separated from her husband, who had left her for another woman. She told a close friend she was going to see a healer in Delhi Serdang who might be able to bring him back. Neighbors saw her board a pedicab heading in the direction of the plantation. She told no one else where she was going. Her family spent years in uncertainty, not knowing whether she had died, left voluntarily, or was alive somewhere and simply not in contact. The uncertainty was its own particular cruelty. These 2 cases are documented. The remaining 40 are known primarily through the physical evidence recovered during the 1997 excavation. Bodies in varying states of decomposition, some identifiable through dental records or belongings, others known only as female remains between 11 and 30 years of age. After Suradji's arrest, Indonesian police issued a public appeal for information. They received reports of approximately 80 additional missing women from the Delhi Serdang district and surrounding areas. Women who had disappeared during the same 11-year period, who matched the same demographic profile, whose cases had never been connected to one another. Not one of those 80 cases was officially linked to Suradji. No additional remains were found beyond the 42 in the plantation field. Those families received no answers. He was 30 deaths short of his target of 72. He had been running the same system in the same location for 11 years. There is nothing in any court document, any psychological evaluation, or any investigator's account that suggests he was planning to stop. April 24, 1997. A 21-year-old woman named Sri Kamala Dewi needed to reach the home of the Datuk. She lived in Medan, and the plantation in Delhi Serdang was not walkable from her neighborhood. She went to a nearby street and found a pedicab driver, a 15-year-old boy named Andreas Pasaribu, working a route he knew well, making the kind of small income that helped support his family. She hired him. She gave him the address. She asked him specifically not to tell anyone where he had taken her. She carried her payment with her, the consultation fee she had saved or borrowed. She was going alone. She did not ask Andreas to wait for her. He dropped her off. She walked toward the property. He pedaled away. 3 days later, Sri Kamala Dewi's body was found in the sugarcane field adjacent to Suradji's land. She was naked. The Sumatran heat and humidity had already begun to decompose the body. Ligature marks were visible on her neck, the physical signature of strangulation. Her family knew she had gone somewhere on April 24th and had not come back. They had begun searching informally before going to police. Someone in the neighborhood knew about the pedicab. They found Andreas Pasaribu. The boy was 15 years old, and he told the truth. He described exactly where he had taken Sri Kamaladewi. He gave the address. He described the property. He gave the name that people in the area used for the man who lived there, the Datuk, Ahmad Suradji. Investigators arrived at the home on the plantation road in Delhi Serdang. Suradji received them calmly. He answered questions in a measured, cooperative tone. He denied knowing anything about the death of Sri Kamaladewi. He denied she had come to his property. He presented himself as a healer who helped people, a man with no reason to harm anyone. The search team went through the house. In the first pass, they found Sri Kamaladewi's handbag, her dress, her bracelet. These items had no explanation. He had no explanation for them. In further searches, investigators found additional items, clothing, jewelry, personal objects that did not belong to any of his 3 wives and were not consistent with anything a cattle breeder and healer would legitimately possess. These items, when matched against missing persons reports that had accumulated over the previous decade in the district's police files, were traceable. They had belonged to women who had been reported missing months or years earlier and never found. Ahmad Suradji was placed in custody on April 30th, 1997. At the police station, the interrogations proceeded across multiple sessions. He denied. He redirected. He questioned the legality of the search. He maintained composure in a way that investigators later described as unnerving, the composure of someone who had spent years operating without consequences and had not yet recalibrated to the reality that consequences had arrived. And then he broke. The shift was not triggered by a piece of evidence being placed in front of him. It came from within his own account. He began to talk. First about Sri Kamaladewi, then about others. Then, without being asked to enumerate them, he gave a number, 42. He explained the ritual without being prompted. He described the method. He described the positioning of the bodies. He said his dead father had appeared to him in 1986 and given him a target of 72. He said he had been working toward that number. He said he was not finished. Then he said something that the investigating team had not expected. He offered to take them to the field and show them where the bodies were. He walked with officers across his property, through the gate, and into the sugarcane plantation. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he had been and what he had done there. He stopped at specific points in the field and indicated locations. He gave descriptions of what would be found and how deep. The excavation teams moved in. They worked in the heat of the North Sumatran spring, carefully removing earth from site after site. The work took days. 42 bodies, all within the boundaries of the same plantation field, on land adjacent to the home of Ahmad Suradji. Many had decomposed to the point where visual identification was impossible. Forensic teams used dental records and the personal belongings recovered from each burial site, items that Suradji had not removed, perhaps because he had not anticipated excavation. Medical examiners worked through the recoverable remains and confirmed the same cause of death in every case where it could be determined: asphyxiation by strangulation. Every body had been positioned identically. Every skull was oriented in the direction of Suradji's house. The community that lived beside and around that field, farmers who worked the plantation, families who had raised children within sight of it, Neighbors who had known Suradji for years had known nothing. They said this uniformly to every journalist and investigator who asked. Nothing had seemed unusual. The Datuk was a respected man. The field was a sugarcane field. They had walked past it hundreds of times. In the weeks after the discovery, journalists and investigators began reviewing the missing persons archives for the Delhi Serdang district going back to 1986. What they found in those files was damaging. Dozens of reports, filed over more than a decade, all involving women who had disappeared from the same geographic area, all from similar socioeconomic backgrounds, all without resolution. Not one investigator had connected them. Not one analyst had identified the pattern. The cases had been processed individually, filed individually, and forgotten individually. The public criticism directed at the North Sumatra police following the arrest was substantial. The department was asked to explain how 42 women could disappear from a single district over 11 years without a single connecting investigation being opened. No satisfactory answer was given. No criminal charges resulted from the institutional failure. The criticism was absorbed and eventually faded, but it established something important on the record. Ahmad Suradji had not only been failed to be stopped, he had been actively enabled by a system that treated the disappearance of poor women as an acceptable administrative outcome. December 11, 1997. The District Court of Lubuk Pakam, the administrative center of Delhi Serdang, a small city south of Medan, unremarkable, except that it was now the site of what Indonesian legal observers were calling the most significant serial murder trial in the country's history. The indictment document against Ahmad Suradji ran 363 pages. It had taken investigators and prosecutors 7 months after his arrest to compile and organize the full evidentiary record. The physical evidence from the excavation, the forensic reports, the matching of recovered belongings to missing persons files, the testimony of witnesses who had seen specific victims entering Suradji's property, and the interrogation records including Suradji's own detailed confessions. The courtroom in Lubuk Pakam was a modest municipal building. It held 80 people at capacity. On the opening day of proceedings, significantly more than that pressed inside, spectators, family members of victims, journalists, and people who had followed the case with the particular intensity that Indonesia reserves for crimes that challenge foundational community assumptions. Outside, a television had been set up at the entrance so that the crowd that could not fit inside could follow the proceedings from the street. Ahmad Suradji sat in the defendant's dock dressed formally. He was 50 years old. He sat with the same composure he had maintained since his arrest, attentive, present, showing no visible distress. Beside him, in a separate dock, sat his wife, Tumini. She was charged as an accomplice to murder. The prosecution's case against her rested on the argument that she had known about the killings, had witnessed or been aware of burial activity on the plantation, and had actively taken steps to conceal evidence rather than report what she knew to authorities. Both defendants had formally retracted their confessions before the trial began. Suradji's defense team argued that his detailed admissions to police, including the voluntary guidance of officers to the burial sites, had been obtained through physical coercion during interrogation. He had been beaten, he said. The statements had been fabricated or distorted. He was an innocent man who had confessed falsely under conditions of extreme duress. Tumini made the same claim. The defense faced structural problems that were difficult to overcome. Suradji had not only confessed in words, he had taken investigators to a field and pointed to the ground, and 42 bodies had been found exactly where he pointed. The physical evidence did not depend on the confessions. The confessions had produced the evidence, and the evidence was the confession's most powerful corroboration. An independent panel of psychiatric experts was appointed by the court to assess Suradji's mental state at the time of the crimes and at the time of trial. They conducted multiple sessions with him. They reviewed the interrogation records, the court documents, and the full evidentiary record. Their findings were entered into the public court record. Ahmad Suradji was legally sane. He had possessed, throughout the entire 11-year killing period, a complete and accurate understanding of what he was doing, what its consequences were under Indonesian law, and what the social and moral meaning of his actions was. His decisions had been deliberate, sustained, and planned. He had designed a system. He had maintained it. He had refined it over time. There was no clinical basis for a diminished responsibility finding under Indonesian criminal law. He had understood completely. He had continued anyway. On April 27, 1998, after 4 months of proceedings, the 3-judge panel delivered their verdict. Ahmad Suradji, guilty on all 42 counts of murder. Sentence, death by firing squad. Tumini, guilty as an accomplice. Sentence, death by firing squad. This was subsequently reviewed on appeal and commuted to life imprisonment. When the verdict against Suradji was read aloud in the courtroom, the reaction was immediate. The room erupted. People stood, they clapped, some shouted. Families of victims who had been present throughout the proceedings, women who had sat in that courtroom week after week, carrying photographs of daughters and sisters and mothers, wept, not from fresh grief, but from the specific release of people who have waited a long time for an answer and finally have one. Outside, on the street, the crowd watching the television reacted the same way. From April 1998 to July 2008, Ahmad Suradji lived on death row in Tanjung Gusta Prison in Medan, a facility that sits in the north of the city, surrounded by a wall, holding a population that includes Indonesia's most dangerous convicted criminals alongside lower-level offenders awaiting processing. He was 50 years old when the verdict was delivered. He would be 59 years old when it was carried out. Between those 2 points, 10 years, 3,650 days approximately, waiting. Shortly after his conviction, he converted to Islam. He had been nominally Muslim before. Islam is the majority religion in Indonesia, and cultural affiliation with the faith is common even among those who practice traditional spiritual systems alongside it. But the conversion that occurred in prison was described by those who observed it as substantive. He studied the Quran consistently and with apparent focus. He learned passages by memory. He discussed religious interpretation with other inmates and with the Islamic scholars and imams who visited the prison as part of the spiritual welfare program for condemned inmates. Prison staff who were asked about him in interviews conducted by journalists in the years after his execution described him as disciplined, quiet, cooperative, a man who followed the rules of the institution without friction and who had found or constructed a stable internal framework for living within the constraints of a death sentence. Among the death row population at Tanjung Gusta, he acquired an unusual status. He was not feared in the way that violent and unstable inmates are feared. He was not isolated. The other condemned prisoners knew who he was. His case had been national news. His name was associated with the largest single-location body discovery in Indonesian criminal history. And that notoriety created a kind of gravitational pull. People listened to him. He became, within the contained social world of the prison block, an informal figure of authority. He gave religious guidance. He helped other inmates think through questions about faith, judgment, and what happens after death. The man who had spent 11 years using the language and authority of spiritual practice to kill 42 women was now using the same capacity for spiritual language to counsel other prisoners facing execution. What that meant, whether it represented genuine transformation or simply a redeployment of the same social skill in a different context, is not something the record can resolve. The people who interacted with him in prison described what they observed. The internal reality behind it remains inaccessible. He filed legal appeals through the Indonesian court system at multiple points during the decade. Indonesian law provides for review by the High Court, the Supreme Court, and for presidential clemency review in capital cases. Suradji pursued available channels. Each appeal was reviewed and denied. The evidentiary record was not the kind that created substantive doubt on appeal. Amnesty International became involved in his case as part of its broader campaign against the death penalty in Indonesia. The organization submitted formal correspondence to the Indonesian government arguing that capital punishment, regardless of the crime, constituted a violation of the right to life under international human rights law. Amnesty did not argue Suradji's innocence. The evidence was not disputable. The argument was categorical. No crime justifies state-sanctioned killing. The Indonesian government did not respond favorably. Indonesia had, during the same period, been carrying out executions of drug traffickers convicted under the country's severe narcotics laws, and the political will to restrict the application of the death penalty was not present in the government of the time. In the final weeks before the scheduled execution date, Suradji was informed formally that all appeals had been exhausted and the sentence would be carried out. He was told the date. He made one request, to see his wife Tumini before the execution. She was serving her life sentence within the same prison system. The authorities considered the request and granted it. They were brought together, a man hours from execution, a woman who would spend the rest of her life in prison, for a final meeting. The content of that conversation was not recorded and was not shared with prison staff. After the meeting, Suradji was returned to his cell. He spoke with guards in the final hours. The words he said, preserved in the prison's records and later reported by Indonesian media, were his last public statement. The black magic came from God. Now I no longer have it. I have repented. I hope I still have a chance to live. He was informed that the execution would proceed as scheduled. July 10, 2008, 9:58 in the evening. The execution was carried out at a designated site in North Sumatra. The firing squad was composed of officers from Brimob, Brigade Mobile, the Special Operations and Rapid Response Unit of the Indonesian National Police. Brimob is the unit tasked by Indonesian law with carrying out capital sentences. Its officers train for this function as part of their institutional role. The procedure is standardized: a bound prisoner, a post, a measured distance, a command. Ahmad Suradji, 59 years old, was executed by firing squad. He was one of 10 people executed in Indonesia in 2008. The majority of the others that year had been convicted of drug trafficking offenses under Indonesia's narcotics law, which carries mandatory death sentences for certain quantities and types of controlled substances. Suradji was the only serial killer among the 10. His case, compared to the drug trafficking executions, generated relatively limited media coverage. The trial had been a decade earlier, and the public attention had long since moved elsewhere. There was no crowd outside the prison. Indonesian law does not permit public executions, and media access to execution sites is restricted. A prison official confirmed the death to reporters. The body was released to his family for burial. He had intended to kill 72 women. He had killed 42. He was stopped 30 short of his stated goal, not by a surveillance operation, not by a tip from an informant, not by a police investigation that had identified a pattern. He was stopped because a 15-year-old pedicab driver told the truth about a fare. 42 cases are closed. 42 families, after years of silence and uncertainty, received answers. Not the answers they had hoped for. No one hopes for a body in a field, but answers. A confirmed death, a cause, a name in a court record, a place for grief to rest instead of continuing to expand in the absence of facts. 80 other families did not receive that. 80 women are still listed as missing in the Delhi Serdang district and surrounding areas. Their disappearances occurred during the same years, in the same geography, among the same demographic profile. Not one of those 80 cases has been officially linked to Ahmad Suradji. There is no physical evidence. No remains were found beyond the 42. There are only the missing persons files, the unchanged designation of whereabouts unknown, and the question that none of the documentation answers. Was 42 really the final number? The sugarcane plantation where the bodies were found was cleared after the excavation. The ground was turned over. No memorial was placed there, no marker, no indication to anyone passing that field today of what the earth once held. Ahmad Suradji believed, to his last day, that what he had done had meaning, that the deaths existed within a framework of spiritual power and divine instruction, that he had been working toward something real. What he had actually been working toward was a number, 72, a number his dead father had given him in a dream. He had killed 42 people to get closer to it. Each of those 42 women had a name, a family, a reason they had come to him, a hope they had carried with them into that field. None of that mattered to him. They were units of progress toward a target. After his execution, Indonesian authorities prosecuted several other Dukuns in separate cases across the country on murder charges. A detailed 2023 analysis published in The Diplomat examined the phenomenon of shaman serial killers in Indonesia and concluded that the Suradji case was not an aberration. It was an extreme expression of a broader pattern, one made possible by the same structural conditions that had allowed Suradji to operate. Deep cultural trust in spiritual practitioners, economic vulnerability of potential victims, limited institutional protection for poor women, and the ease with which disappearances in certain communities are absorbed into administrative silence rather than criminal investigation. Those structural conditions did not end with Suradji's execution. The Dukun system did not end. The poverty did not end. The gap between what official institutions offer and what desperate people need did not close. What changed on July 10, 2008 was only this. One man who had exploited all of those conditions for 11 years, who had killed 42 people in a single field behind his house, who had positioned every body pointing toward his home, that man was gone. The conditions that produced him remained.